Hi American literature friends, this is a terminology video. It is going to go through one of the most difficult concepts, one of the most complicated concepts that's on our syllabus, modernism. And as I begin to talk through this, you may begin to understand why it's such a difficult and complicated concept. In a very general sense, modernism refers to this literary, social, cultural, artistic movement that started roughly around 1910, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, and ended maybe in the began to end in the 1940s, was totally finished ending, had concluded by the early 1960s, by the mid 1960s. So it lasts, depending on how you figure it, it lasts about 50 years. It covers roughly the first half of the 20th century, although if you live in Europe or a European historian, it might feel a little different than in the United States. It's a social and cultural movement. It's traditionally associated with the first half of the 20th century, especially with World War I as the sort of touchstone or landmark. By the time World War I begins, it's clear that modernism has begun. And World War II. When World War II ends, modernism begins to wind down and become something else. But also with the end of the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, the death of Queen Victoria, who had ruled England when England was the most powerful country in the world, and Queen Victoria finally passes away in 1901, and there is this sense that after she had passed, after these 70 years of stability that she had brought, the world begins to change. And the ending of it is people often point to several technological and social and cultural events, like the invention of television, but also the Holocaust in World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II as sort of the beginning of the end of modernism. Modernism includes the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the Harlem Renaissance, the Lost Generation, as well as I said, the Depression of the 1930s. New storytelling methods appeared during this period, especially language interpretation by European writers like James Joyce, but also American writers like William Faulkner, and the exploration of the interior landscape, the inner self, that the invention of psychology and sort of innovations about how people's minds worked and what their inner landscapes might look like. Writers like Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, and Faulkner. The modernist period is marked by anxiety and uncertainty about traditional structures like organized religion, economics, the human psyche, to adequately explain or make sense of the world and human experience. One of the sort of landmarks of modernism is this sort of people beginning to lose faith in traditional structures of government or religion or things like that to completely explain or help people understand the world and make sense of their experience in the world. There was also a widespread belief against that sort of losing faith and lack of faith in these traditional structures that had sort of held Western culture together for hundreds of years. Against that, there was a widespread belief, especially among artists and writers, that storytelling and art played an important role in helping people make sense of the world and their own experience, and in creating shared and unifying experiences. There was this general thought that in the face of this sort of disordered world fragmenting and falling apart, and people sort of losing faith in central structures to help them understand the world and their place in it, one of the things that art and stories and literature could do was give that to people and help them have, again, those unifying shared experiences. To broaden that out a little bit, I'm going to jump over here just so that you understand too that modernism is not just a literary movement. It encompasses everything. Social and cultural. Again, there's a lot of technological innovations that have to do with modernism, like the move away from the horse and buggy to cars and things like that, and the invention of airplanes, which also happens in the early modernist period. And so there's all these technological innovations. The radio becomes popular, records become popular during the modernist period. So there is this sort of birth of mass communication. The first movies come out during the modernist period. The first movie comes out in 1915. As they say here, modernism is both a philosophical movement and an art movement that arose from broad transformations, like I was talking about, these sort of changes that are all these different changes that are happening in Western society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The movement reflected desire for the creation of new forms of art, religion, philosophy, and social organization. The poet Ezra Pound's 1934 injunction to make it new was the touchstone, the sort of like bumper sticker slogan of the movement. Modernist innovations included abstract art, stream of consciousness novel, montage cinema, all these different kinds of movement, parody. Modernism also rejected the certainty of Enlightenment thinking, this sort of I think therefore I am, Enlightenment thinking that eventually science and the human mind was capable of understanding everything. Modernism comes along and says, maybe the human mind isn't even capable of knowing itself, so you need a psychologist to help you understand yourself. And if you can't really even know yourself, how can you know or comprehend the world? And many modernists also rejected religious beliefs. You can easily point to Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, as one of the sort of founding fathers of modernism, and his sort of his famous quotation, "God is dead," but what he's really referring to is this sort of religion has lost its sort of dominating influence in Western culture to organize people's lives and help them make meaning out of their lives. A notable characteristic of modernism is self-consciousness concerning artistic and social traditions. This sort of self-awareness that you're part of a timeline that is changing, perhaps even rapidly changing faster than you might be able to understand. Some scholars see modernism continuing into the 21st century. That's largely not true, and especially not true with literature. Others see it evolving into late modernism or high modernism, and then ending and becoming postmodernism. When you talk about literature, postmodernism very clearly comes after modernism. You might say that happens in the 1940s, you might say it happens in the early 1960s, but modernism is a very clear time period that ends sometime between the 1940s and the 1960s. They show you here Picasso is maybe the most famous modernist painter or artist. Frank Lloyd Wright is perhaps the most famous modernist sculptor. And they also talk, as they mentioned, the rejection of Enlightenment thinking and religious beliefs and things like that. Three of the most important modernist thinkers are Freud, who I talked about, and the invention of psychology and this sort of lack of certainty of the human mind to comprehend or contain everything. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, as I said, who sort of evokes that loss of faith in organized religion to give meaning to people's lives. And then Karl Marx and his sort of criticism of capitalism and of governments as the traditional governments up to the 20th century to effectively give meaning to people's lives and give them a sense of order in their lives, which is why one of the things you get in the modernist period is the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, this sort of rise of socialism and communism, in part because of the lack of faith or the loss of faith in these traditional governments and traditional systems. So modernism covers a lot more than simply literature, but it is very clearly reflected in literature. In America, the big modernists are T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, and also and F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is often considered a masterpiece in modernist literature. Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, several of Faulkner's novels. So those are the big American modernists. There's many more, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some important ones. But those are, you could easily put those on the like Mount Rushmore of modernism. If you have questions about modernism or want to dig a little deeper into it, or some part of it, like the psychology of it or the economics of it, I'll be happy to dig deeper into that with you. But hopefully that's a useful introduction for you into modernism as this sort of literary time period from the 19-teens into the 1940s, 1950s. Thanks a lot.